Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we are recording this session. So all of our lovely CSA farmers in the CSA Innovation Network's audience can share this wonderful education with your CSA members. Today, we are welcoming Frances from Cooking with Our CSA to the CSA Ideas Lab this month, which is all about helping CSA members be successful and sustain their membership within a CSA. I'm Sadie, the network coordinator for the CSA Innovation Network, and happy to have you here for the CSA Ideas Lab this month. Just a couple of reminders as we get into the presentation. Please do make sure you are staying on mute. You're welcome to have your camera on, particularly near the end of the presentation. We'll have time for Q&A, which is great for you to be able to engage with us. And in the meantime, you can use the chat to introduce yourself and ask questions to Frances during the presentation. Like I mentioned, we are recording this, which is awesome so that we can share it with even more farmers and CSA members after the presentation today. And we will just have a very brief introduction to the CSA Innovation Network to those of you who might be newer to our audience. And then, like I said, we'll be hearing from Frances, who is joining us from Pomona, California. She runs the cooking blog, Cooking with Our CSA, and is a recipe developer based on utilizing seasonal produce from a CSA share. So Frances will introduce herself a little bit more in depth, but then we'll have a chance for a question and answer period after her presentation, and then we'll wrap up in just about an hour or so. So the CSA Innovation Network is a network of technical assistance providers around farming and specifically community-supported agriculture, along with some farmer friends and partners. You can see our group had a chance to gather out on the East Coast in the Hudson Valley region of New York just about a month ago, and we do this annually to just reaffirm the mission and vision of the network, plan shared work efforts like the CSA Ideas Lab and other activities that we deliver to all of you. So feel free to check out more about us on our website, and you can always get in touch with me through the CSA Innovation Network email as well. And now I'll hand things over to Frances to talk about just building CSA member successful patterns and habits to help you have the best season overall as a CSA member. Thanks, Frances.
Thanks, Sadie. Hi, everyone. So happy you're here and so glad to see you all today. And I am very excited to talk a little bit more in depth about ways to keep the momentum of cooking with the CSA through the season going. Today, we're going to dive more deeply into pantry essentials. So thinking about this from the context of if you have a CSA member who is new, this is their first CSA season, or someone who's just even new to cooking in general, thinking about some of the essentials that have helped, especially my family and me along the way in our cooking through a CSA for the better part now of 4 years. We'll also talk about 3 very simple beginner-friendly ways to preserve CSA produce. That's always a common question I hear from CSA members around how do I make sure that produce doesn't spoil quickly, and have a couple of ways that we've been able to do that successfully as well. On the next slide, just sharing a little bit about the goal and premise of Cooking with Our CSA. It's a food website dedicated to sharing recipes and tips for home cooks that highlight the seasonality of produce that's grown from our local farm CSAs. When it comes to the context of where I'm coming from, on the next slide, just a little bit of info about me. I'm sharing meal ideas and recipes. I've been doing that now for the better part of 4 years. We joined the Sage Mountain Farm CSA. They're based in Anza, California. It's about an hour and a half south of where I live in Pomona, California. And they have a drop-off point at the Claremont Farmers Market every Sunday. And so we joined that CSA in April 2020 and have continued on for a good long while now. My passion for that is noted on the next slide as we talk about cooking with our CSA and 3 practices that have helped us. The next slide highlights just couple of quick facts. If you weren't here for the first webinar series or you haven't yet been able to catch the recording, I talk a little bit more about how we got started with the CSA. But 3 quick facts here. 90% of the produce that we use for our family of 4, I have 2 small kiddos, comes from this CSA box. And so we're also really fortunate where we are in Southern California that this CSA is year round. So we've not had a season where we've gone without a CSA box. I think that experience has really helped us find a rhythm and groove for cooking sustainably with the bulk of our produce coming from the farm CSA. We're supplementing here and there as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a moment. But for the better part of that, the majority of our produce that we're using for our meals is coming from the farm CSA. That being said, meal planning happens right when we get home and unpack the CSA box. And from there, I'm deciding on additional ingredients we might need, as well as pantry staples to add in as well. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the 3 practices. There are 3, when I think about the time that we have spent cooking with our CSA, 3 things that kind of ground us in doing this work week to week for the better part of 4 years. When I pick up the CSA box, I tend to scan the box right away. So Julie is usually there on Sundays when I pick up the box, then I'll take a quick peek, taking note of produce that we're getting, and then deciding from there to purchase any additional produce items. So if there's like additional garlic, or right now as peppers might be coming in, and whatever it might be, where if I didn't get it in the box that week, then I'm either purchasing additional items either at that farm stand or farm stands nearby, just because where our pickup is at the local farmers market each week. During the unpacking at home, that's where I'm shopping our pantry, our freezer, the fridge, trying to look at what additional items we have and what hasn't been used, so that it helps me to kind of think about what needs to get used right away, so nothing's going to waste, and then build out the deeper game plan for what we're doing with that week's produce box. And so those were things that weren't inherent practices when we were first starting out as CSA members. And so I share these in the interest that if we're new to CSA, or if you're a farmer who has members who are new, helpful practices like this go a long way in helping to encourage and promote the sustainability of cooking with the CSA through the season. We'll now go into, on the next slide, diving into those pantry essentials. And I'll preface this, as we'll see on the next slide, things to consider when stocking a pantry. And so I want to highlight that where we are today, where my family and I are today in terms of how we've stocked a pantry, what that's looked like for us, has really evolved over time. And so things to consider, it's okay to start small and intentionally. There isn't a need to have a huge cabinet space or a lot of ingredients. It's really about thinking about what are the ingredients that we tend to gravitate to and enjoy. So if you're a CSA member here either watching the recording or here live, don't feel like you need to buy all of those specialty ingredients, or buying a jar of something that you find in a given recipe that you're only going to use maybe once, and that it kind of sits in the cabinet and you may not have a game plan for either. So that's always been kind of a grounding principle for me of whatever I'm bringing into the pantry space and the cupboards, that I know I'm going to want to use it time and again. And the way that we get to that kind of space of I'm comfortable with the ingredients that I have is through the repetition of trying different recipes and seeing what feels good, what tastes good, what we enjoy, what feels also feasible. So that observation of flavor profiles and taking note of ingredients, depending on how many people you're feeding in your household, taking note of what everyone's enjoying and ways to adapt. On the next slide, thinking about different flavors and dietary preferences. So that can also be when thinking about stocking the pantry. Different types of flours. For our family, there aren't too many dietary restrictions in terms of the need to be gluten-free or dairy-free. It might be more of a preference at times, so we tend to lean more plant-forward in our meals, but thinking about what what members might want or need as far as dietary preferences and how that informs the kinds of ingredients they might want to include in a given pantry. And so I'll share that with, as we go into the next slide, introducing the different pantry essentials, sharing that with the caveat of the list isn't meant to be exclusive. So what you might see like in the images here on the slides or the things that I might share as far as ingredients that we've gravitated towards isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but rather an encouraging point of thinking about what are the ones that we gravitate to most and what we enjoy the best when it comes to crafting the recipes we use to cook with the CSA. So to start with that, dried and or canned beans and legumes are super helpful pantry staple. We may already have these in our cupboards. And so I think about like lately, I've been working on a recipe series where we're cleaning out the pantry and trying to make sure that we're using all of those items up. And so earlier this week, we made, I think, pasta fagioli with the cranberry beans that you see on the slide here. Canned beans add a heft of protein and fiber. That's always well and good. And they're just really helpful to either make a bean dish with seasonal vegetables, like zucchinis coming into view now. So I could definitely see something like the Marsala beans or cannellini beans, whether canned or dried, kind of slow simmered with some zucchini and some seasonal greens, some fresh herbs, like some mint or basil, and then maybe a dollop of pesto. And then you've got this dish, right? So it's just kind of thinking about pantry staples from the dried beans or canned beans group that I can have on hand on the regular. Doesn't have to be a variety of beans. Pick the ones that you like. For me, I personally love garbanzo, cannellini, black beans, lentils. Pinto beans are a big one because I'll either have those like with a fried egg for breakfast or a top rice or refried beans for like taco night. It's always good too. On the next slide, we'll talk now about a variety of flours. This again is also really dependent on your individual tastes and preferences. We have a variety of flours in our pantry, some over the years where if it's like pastry flour, I like to use for pie crusts if I have some extra time, and I'll make a batch of pie crusts to freeze and have that on hand. There are a variety of flours that also meet dietary preferences. So if it's gluten-free, paleo, etc. Bread flour I'll have on hand for just some quick breads. Whole wheat for pancakes, pastries, muffins, and the like. And then my favorite of late has been masa harina to make tortillas, corn tortillas, quick and easy, and double O flour for pizza dough. So it kind of stretches the range of if I have pizza dough on hand and we're entering summer, there might be some like tomatoes are coming into season. So pizza margherita is always a great one in our household. And just thinking about how we have these staples in hand to have some adaptability with the recipes we might choose to craft. The next slide gets into assorted dried pastas and grains. So again, picking from what feels like you'll get the most use out of. In my household right now, I have two kiddos that also like to choose pasta shapes. So we might have a variety of different cuts of pasta. If it's penne or right now they're into shells. So if I can keep that in the house and then doing that, it's just another way of thinking about, okay, pastas, grains, rice, quinoa is another one. Farro, I love for like a risotto style dish if I don't have arborio rice on hand. Couscous is another great one. We have pearled couscous. That's also really great for summer salads. And like with cucumber, tomatoes, and a really zesty dressing. All my favorites there. Moving on to oils and vinegars. So here is one that I definitely would encourage CSA members to really think about the range of types of oils and vinegars. And this is definitely one where you can buy pricier bottles of oil and vinegar, and you can definitely think about where you would like to stretch your dollars. And so I share that just because thinking about the purpose of what I'm going to use said oil and vinegar for. One, marinades, super great. when it comes to salad dressings, I may opt for a higher quality olive oil, something that is lighter to the palate, something that has a fruitier flavor and a very delicious texture that will work well for the dressings and lets the flavor, especially the vinegar, come through, depending on what types of vinegars I'm wanting to use. It really can depend on what you like. For instance, and I think I shared this in the first webinar, I had bought a bottle of plum vinegar and I had only used it once. And I think it's still sitting in my cupboard. And I haven't figured out like another plan for it other than, but I tend to lean heavily towards say balsamic. Whenever there's a couple of seasonal fruit vinegars that our local olive oil shop has, that's one I tend to love to use and reserve for those types of dressings. Vinegars, I love a good syrupy balsamic. They're super versatile for dressings, even just kind of stand alone. So thinking about ingredients that you like. And I also tend to really love where I don't need to do a lot to make a said dressing for a salad. If I have a really good quality syrupy balsamic, some olive oil, a little salt and pepper, the dressing is done and dinner is ready in minutes. And I think we can all appreciate when that happens. When thinking about jarred sauces and canned tomatoes on the next slide, another super helpful pantry staple to have on hand. There are times where I think I'm a passionate home cook. So when it comes to making sauces from scratch, I definitely love doing that. But there's also times where convenience really needs to win the day for us, and having jarred sauces or really prepared sauces or even like simmered sauces. There are some food brands that already have sauces at the ready, and all I need to do is just add in my veggies, protein of choice, and dinner is ready in 10 to 15 minutes. Having a variety of those sauces and jarred items that are really helpful to you as a home cook, if you're a CSA member, or for farmers, encouraging your CSA members, really having those kinds of back pocket jarred ingredients at the ready can be very helpful. And then to that end, we have a couple of more pantry essentials or categories here. We have 3 more. This next one gets into dried fruits and nuts. Super versatile, having them on hand for either, yes, a homemade trail mix, but I personally will put them as a garnish in salads. Homemade nut milk is another one. I also love to add them to homemade granola or to even grind the nuts down for a grain-free crust for meat or your protein of choice, just depending. Having dried nuts, seeds on hand also offers a really nice texture. So when I think about like during the summer months where we start to get a lot of seasonal greens, we're getting the zucchini, we're getting the tomatoes, and making a lot of summer salads, the texture of the variety of vegetables can have an impact on just how much I'm enjoying either flavor profiles and whatnot. And so the texture afforded by nuts and seeds just adds a little bit of crunch. And I personally love having a lot of those on hand in the pantry. The last 2 that we're getting to here really center on flavor, like seasoning our food. And when I think about the sustainability of cooking with a CSA, the pastas, the grains, rice, and the jarred sauces, those are all things that were really helpful. Well, when I think about what makes the meal taste delicious, this really comes down to seasoning. So the first one here, thinking about those umami accents. And this again gets into flavor profiles that we enjoy. I tend to have a lot of tomato paste on hand for a quick pizza sauce or quick tomato sauce for pasta or chili, which gets now into like summertime when I think about barbecues. We have a different variety of chili crisps. So I love salsa matcha or chili crisp that I can put atop eggs if I'm doing a breakfast salad with some seasonal greens from our CSA box, or a breakfast bowl with a lot of sauteed veggies and some grains, top it with a fried egg and some chili crisp. And I am a very happy eater. So we have our Kalamata olives, you have anchovy paste if you're making a dressing, capers, soy sauce, you name it. So thinking about what are those ingredients that just add that umami taste that really amplify the flavors of the produce we're enjoying, and making sure that those are the ones I want to have on hand. And then finally, we get into the dried herbs and spices. And if I were to do like a screenshot of the spice cabinet, it's definitely grown over time. If I think about when first starting out, I think I started with some garlic powder, onion powder, kosher salt, ground black pepper or black peppercorns if you want to grind them yourself. And then I personally loved having crushed red pepper flakes and an assortment of either dried thyme and basil and oregano. And if I just started with those, like that gives us a really good base to begin and build from. So again, if I'm just starting out, if you're a CSA member just starting out building a pantry and you're like, there's so many spices, where do I start? You know, starting out with a few of those and then adding on more as you desire. So now I think we have all kinds of different spices and herbs and seasonings that go a long way to either make our own marinades, add it to dressings, or season roast chicken or turkey, all kinds of good stuff there. That covers pantry. So thinking about all of those elements that can go into the pantry. What now we're going to turn our attention to as a CSA member, how do I go about preserving said foods? Because I think in the past session, in our first session, and then continuing on here, I've talked a little bit about how we've like frozen foods or tried to preserve. So now I'm going to talk about 3 very simple, beginner-friendly ways to preserve CSA produce. And they really center on 1, fruit compotes. We'll talk about quick pickling and then making the freezer our friend. So first up, fruit compotes. If I'm a CSA member who hasn't yet made jams or preserves, fruit compotes from my initial experiences 4 years ago was such a wonderful entry point to cooking down the fruit, and then I could freeze it. It's super freezer friendly and be able to preserve the beauty of said fruit for later season to enjoy. So in this picture here, we have some cherry compote. I've also linked a couple of recipes here. So for the farmers in our audience, if you'd like to share those links to recipes with CSA members, feel free to do so. It just gives people a good jumping off point to figuring out how do I go about doing this if it's not something I've done before. So compotes are super beginner friendly. Essentially, they're cooking up the whole fruit or chunks of fruit down with a bit of sugar. And you can also vary. If you don't want to use granulated sugar, I've made compotes with maple sugar, maple syrup, and even a little bit of honey. And so the juices from the fruit that are mixed with that sugar create a syrup that you can also flavor. I've personally loved experimenting with fresh herbs. Thyme and rosemary are 2 of my favorites when it comes to the fruit compotes. And you can freeze them, pour them up into tempered glass or freezer safe containers. And you can keep them in your freezer for up to a year. And proof positive, I'm going through the last of our blueberry compote that I made last July. And so it's been a wonderful treat for our morning oats and yogurt. So fruit compote's one easy, simple way to preserve seasonal fruit you might be getting in your CSA box and really kind of saving the season in that way. Quick pickling is another second method for saving the season or preserving produce. It gives us about a month lead time, I would say, as compared to, say, more traditional forms of pickling. So again, super beginner friendly way. If you're a CSA member who has not done that, but you're kind of like, I'd be really interested in how to do this, I have 2 very simple recipes for refrigerator pickles and pickled red onion. I love these for either sandwiches, atop salads, burgers, if you're summertime grilling, and then pickled red onions I personally love in breakfast tacos or breakfast taco bowls. Those are always really, really great. But we make a quick pickling brine and then pour that over our prepared vegetables. Cucumbers, especially when they come into prominent season starting summer, and then red onions are a few. You could also do this with carrots, with shallot. It's always great. And so as a kind of beginner point to quick pickling to save, I remember doing this a couple of years ago. We had quite a few cucumbers. So I was using them in a variety of salads, pickles, even making like an alla fresca with cucumber and watermelon, which was really delicious. And then our final, like, quick, simple way to preserve produce is really making the freezer our friend. And this has been one where I haven't listed all of that here on the slide, but I'll share with you here. When I think about leveraging the freezer in this way, one, when it comes to something like the blueberry compote, is that we want to make sure, so for the home cooks viewing or watching, making sure that our prepared sauce or compote is cooled to room temperature before storing in the refrigerator, letting that just continue to cool, and then we can freeze it as long as we have that airtight seal. It will then keep well, and we won't run the risk of freezer burn, one, and two, we also won't run the risk of glass breaking. I also share that from experience because there was one time, like 3 years ago, that happened, and I had a crack in the glass, and then the chicken stock was all over my freezer floor, but we're good. So with that in mind, keeping in mind, making sure it's all cooled down to room temp before we begin the freezing process. The other helpful tip is making sure that we labeling with what's in the jar and the date. Super helpful when we're trying to keep track of what's in the jar and when did I make this, so that I can fold that into our continuous, oh, I need to make sure that this gets used by X date. Other parts or points where the freezer is very, very friendly for us is in the immediate freezing of greens. I have found that if I get a bunch of kale, for instance, I think there was a couple of weeks in a row where it was just lots of different greens, and kale and spinach were a few of those, that I would immediately wash those greens. If I wanted to give them a rough chop, I could, or at least remove the stems. I'm thinking of kale a lot because that was one I remember we were getting a lot of. And then removing the leaves from the stems, compost the stems or add them to your green waste bin or wherever else, right? So just discarding the stems. And then the greens I would put in a freezer safe bag and then stick them in the freezer. So then I had kind of like what we would get at the grocery store, right? You have bags of frozen veggies at the ready. So what better way to do that than to incorporate that practice into the CSA produce that we're receiving? So if I have a bunch of one ingredient, Anaheim peppers is another one that came to mind in summer. I had a big old box of them, and I didn't have an immediate game plan for the week for those peppers. I washed them, took off the stems, removed the seeds, and then gave them a different variety of chops. So I either did a fine dice on one, strips for the other, for like fajitas for one night, and then the others also left whole. Put them in their separate freezer bags, labeled and dated them, put them in the freezer. And then I had assorted prepped peppers for whatever dishes, whether it was a breakfast scramble or enchiladas or fajitas, whatever the case may be, then I've already prepped and preserved what I was receiving from the abundant CSA box that we received. So there's so many different ways that we can make freezing a very helpful, beginner-friendly way for us to preserve our CSA produce so it doesn't go to waste. So I'm hoping that's helpful. And I think, yeah, now we have some time for questions here. So that covers a lot of those pieces of beginning and sustaining that momentum in cooking with a CSA. And so let me take a look. What questions can I help answer?
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so we can see each other. If you want to turn your videos on, feel free. We just had one question so far submitted in the chat, which is whether the links to recipes will be available, which yes, we will make sure to send out those links along with the presentations and the recording of today's presentation. We also have the presentation and recording from session number 1 with Francis. So that will all go out over email and be available on our social media. Does anybody else have other questions that you want to ask Frances about these techniques for CSA member success that she has shared, or anything about her process as a CSA member?
Francis, I have a question on your freezing, specifically when you mentioned putting the dates on it so you know when it goes bad. When does it go bad? Do you have any tips on knowing when you open something in the freezer and you're like, nope, maybe I missed that window, or how you navigate that.
Yeah. Oh, I love this question, Tess. So thank you so much. There are, when it comes to the freezer greens, for instance, I try to give myself anywhere from 6 months to no more than a year to use them. I think most produce as well as prepared foods can have a freezer lifespan or freezer shelf time of anywhere from 3 to 12 months, depending on what we've prepared. So an example of that could be if it's a prepared meal, like say I've pre-made lasagna and have frozen it prior to baking. So that means I get to all the steps of preparing noodles and the like and assembled my lasagna, but I have not yet baked it. Then I would want to give myself about 3 months before I would see signs of freezer burn. My personal practices at home tend to veer more towards the like compotes, sauces, jams, jellies, and the like. And those tend to have shelf lives that really push upwards to about a year. Signs of spoilage really look at like crystallization. So if I'm starting to see some freezer burn around the outer edges, which I haven't to this point, but it's just helpful to kind of keep in mind that can affect taste and texture. So once things have defrosted, or once those items have defrosted and you just kind of give it either a smell or a taste, you'll know quickly of like, this is a little bit stale, or that isn't the texture that it once was, then it's, when in doubt, toss it out. It's kind of my motto for that. For the most part, I would say having that guideline, I'm usually trying to aim to use any and all of those ingredients within like the preceding season, so 3 to 6 months out. As a fun fact, I did find a batch of gooseberries in the freezer that I had to make a jam for because I was like, oh, those have been there like 9 months. So yeah, that's like the next project, but yeah, hoping that's helpful.
I am also going to link in the chat a wonderful cookbook by someone I know here in Wisconsin about freezing primarily produce and different methods to do that. So we'll include that as another resource.
Yeah. Timothy, I see Timothy's question about preserving tomatoes. Yes, you can freeze them whole. You do not need to can them. I've done just a quick wash of just the outer skins and no other dicing or processing beyond wash them, dry them with a clean linen kitchen towel, and then place them in a freezer safe bag, label and date. And as an example, there was a beautiful variety of heirloom tomatoes that my friend Dessa, she has her own farm as well, a micro farm in Upland. And that was, let's see, we got those tomatoes in January, and then in December, we made a roast tomato sauce with those fresh tomatoes. I froze them with the stems on, so you can wash them, dry them, so you don't have that excess moisture, place them in the freezer bag, label and date, and you're good to go for about 6 months.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question, Tim, because we get a lot of tomatoes in the summer as CSA members. It's definitely one of the top items that farmers grow for their members. And it is really hard to get through a lot of fresh tomatoes unless you're putting them away. Canning is not super beginner friendly, with tomatoes being sometimes on the lower acid side too.
Right.
Thanks for sharing.
One, I think it's making me think about one kind of thing to keep in mind when doing that is that freezing can affect texture in the defrost. So if I'm freezing a fruit like tomato whole, I want to, the chances are that my plans for the future are going to be sauce adjacent to that, because I'm not going to have like fresh tomato salad. Those are the kinds of things when I think about even seasonal cooking, I deeply appreciate savoring the season of a fresh tomato sliced on toasted bread, rubbed with a little bit of garlic, some pesto, and enjoying the freshness of that tomato now, but then freezing a batch of them to come back to in late fall, early winter to make a beautiful roast tomato sauce or even a tomato confit, and relish, like remember and recall, right, the beauty of summer. So those things to keep in mind. When we freeze, we are freezing also with the recognition point that texture may be a factor in the defrost, but that's okay as long as we have the game plan for that.
Are there any other questions from folks on the call? Otherwise, I have a few that I can run through. Okay. So Francis, I was wondering if you have any good resources to share for farmers to suggest to their members as use it up meals. Like you mentioned, whenever you get back home with your CSA pickup, you're saying, okay, what is still left in my fridge before I load it up with all of this new produce for the week? Is there a go-to dinner for like that, Sunday night, I think is the day that you pick up your CSA, to sort of clear out anything that's lingering from the past week that needs to be used?
Oh, I love this question. I'm trying to think of one. I have a number of recipes on the blog, so we'll definitely link to that in the notes. But if I were to think about some go-to dinners that I tend to gravitate towards when it comes to using up ingredients, I call it a dinner toast with like garlicky greens is one that comes to mind. So I'll do this a few times, over the course of a given month, where it's, if I've got, like in January, I can think back to, we had a bunch of broccoli greens, some kale, some chard, just like all kinds of different things. And sauteing that down, cooking them down until wilted with loads of garlic. I personally love garlic. So if you're not the biggest fan of garlic, you can totally leave it out or use very, very tiny amounts. But I'm talking like 10 cloves, garlicky greens on a really nice piece of toast with a fried egg. And that's been like kind of a go-to simple meal that uses up a lot of those greens right away. The other types of dinners are, I like grain bowls. So I'll cook up a batch of grains for the week. Personally, I love the chewy texture of farro and that it will keep well for the week ahead. So I'll cook some farro up in a little bit of broth, vegetable broth or chicken broth, whichever you prefer, and then adding that in with whatever veggies we might have on hand. So if I have, say, some tomatoes and cucumber to use up, I won't necessarily cook down the cucumbers. So I might have like, okay, let me add some tomato, cucumber, maybe a little bit of feta, some Kalamata olives. And then if I've got some leftover roast proteins, then I'm adding that together, chop up some fresh herbs, and that's super simple. And there aren't recipes like that I have quite yet on the blog, but it's also making me think of writing up kind of a swap outs, which is probably a precursor to what we're going to talk about in session 3 with our virtual cooking class, of when cooking with our CSA, we can really kind of swap and substitute those ingredients. And if I know if I've got a grain, if I've got some of those leftover veggies that need to get used, and then I have my umami accents, right? Like we were talking about earlier, I can mix and match and just toss that together. So grain bowls are one I gravitate towards, dinner toast with some sauteed greens. Soups are super simple. Summer feels a little maybe less inviting to make soup, but I will still do it on occasion because it's a great way to make sure that those ingredients are used and enjoyed.
Wonderful. Thanks. Yeah, that does sound like a good set of template recipes or just ideas about like how to plug in those odds and ends of veggies that you didn't use from last time. And then I see Tim is asking about turnips or any other like unusual items, experience that you might have with those or
Ooh.
recipes.
I mean, I've come across, so one, I'm really appreciative of even the suggestion in your question, Tim, about thinking about like what are some tips for products that we're not used, if I'm not used to seeing, like what can we do? And I can think of produce items that were new to me at the time. So if they were like one, I personally really, really loved and enjoyed. So I don't have anything for turnips, only because we've not had turnips in our box. So much of the recipes that I'm crafting are coming from what we're getting in the box. that I remember the first summer with shishito peppers, and I had not cooked with them before. And so blistering shishito peppers is like a really solid option because they're small peppers, thin peppers, so we can quickly saute those up and we have that nice kind of smoky heat. But 2 summers ago, I made shishito rellenos. And so I ended up kind of treating it like a chili relleno, where I had the cheese, like a little bit of cheese that I put in there, and then a nice tempura batter. And it was such a fun summertime appetizer that I make those now at least 3 times a summer when we get those in our box. And so it's the, I think, invitation to the creativity as far as we want to stretch it for ourselves as home cooks of what are some other ways that I can enjoy the ingredients year round, especially so I don't burn out. But to that end, it's giving me inspiration for your question to kind of put together a resource guide for readers on the website. So thank you for that too.
Francis, for those ingredients that are new to you, I know you mentioned last time that you sometimes would just asked your farmer, like Amy, hey, what is this? And what do
Yeah.
you do with it? Is there something else you tend to go to if you forget or didn't have the chance to ask up front? Like just Googling, how could I turnips
Yeah.
recipe on Google, or what's your first step?
There's an app I've used on the phone. Sometimes it's consistent, but it's called Seek. And it's the one I have on here right now. I don't know if how consistent it is, and I'm pulling it up, but I'll take a picture of the produce item and then it'll give me a recommendation. So if there are apps that viewers have or CSA members have, or they're able to download. So if it's like a identify, right? Typically used for things like identifying plants. I'll do that on my hikes and go like, what plant is this? And take a picture and it'll give me the close identification of it. So that's been one way I've been able to get around trying to figure out what the ingredient that's new to me is. Google, yes, of course, where it's just kind of like, I think this is what it is. Amy and I always have fun email exchanges where I'm trying to get the hang of identifying greens. And I will also just taste. So if I'm trying to decide, is this a mustard green or something else, or arugula or spinach, because sometimes the leaves can look pretty similar just depending on what I'm seeing. I'll just take a quick sample. If it's peppery, then I'm thinking, okay, this is either arugula or mustard green and the like. But with that in mind, then I'll look to, I have a pretty robust collection of cookbooks. Perla Myers is one of my favorites, who really focuses on seasonal cooking. And so those are ones that I gravitate towards around different types of recipes. There are a variety of cookbooks I personally have and that have been helpful to me over time. So for home cooks, looking to the cookbooks that inspire us is a great way to continue getting ideas for what to do and what to make. Your favorite types of website resources. I'm hoping Cooking with Our CSA is one of them that, kind of shares ideas for those ingredients. It's what I can say even about Cooking with Our CSA is it's ever growing and evolving. It's a young blog. It's just a couple of years in, really. So there's lots of recipes that are continuing to come to help continue to inspire home cooks to cook seasonally and with CSAs and supporting our local farms in the process. So lots of different ways to do that and to do it well.
Great. I've got something in mind from a question I got about resources that farmers can provide to their members to help with the meal planning process or supplementing their CSA share, like you talked about shopping the farmers market or shopping your grocery. Is there anything that you use at home, like a list on your fridge of what's in there right now, or like what staples you need to restock on? Or maybe like storage priority of like these things from the CSA need to be used first. These things can hang on for a week or two. What sorts of like education have you built around the meal planning and using your
Oh,
CSA box,
oh.
and how farmers might be able to incorporate that in what they provide to members?
Yeah, a fantastic question. One, I do have a mini kind of like both digital and something that I can print where I'm taking inventory. It's not totally fancy, but I'm also happy to share it with farmers if they would, send me an email and I can send over the file. That's not a problem at all. It's really easy to download, print. So if somebody wants to, write it on their tablet or print it out and then just take note, it's a very quick kind of graphic organizer, if you will, that kind of helps me to categorize what's in stock and helping me kind of think about what the game plan is. So that's one. Two, I also have a CSA kind of starter guide. And so it kind of talks a little bit about some of the tips that we've talked about here, and also a sampling of recipes organized by the seasons. So it's another one as well. So people who are CSA members, those who are CSA members, you're welcome to subscribe, sign up with your email, and then you'll get that as just a thank you. And then farmers, if you would also like to, you can reach out via email and I'm happy to send it your way to just include. Those items have some tips and strategies for just ongoing meal planning, as well as kind of an overview of by the season, what typically tends to be in season and what can I, as a home cook that's a CSA member, kind of think through what's coming and what I have and how I can start to meal plan around that. I think those are the big ones right now, but it's also the wheels are turning of other types of things that we can craft and share as resources to help with meal planning. Meal planning is a big one. Each Sunday, I have a post that goes on the blog. So if you're on the website, the tab is meal plans, and you'll get kind of an overview of the week of what we're planning to make. And I try to link either recipes that I have on the blog or recipes that I've either cooked from. So I'll link to other recipes as well. I wanted that part of the page to be a really helpful resource to readers that isn't necessarily my blog specific, but also just like, here's an idea of what we're going to do for dinner this week on Wednesday. And I may not have a recipe for that here on the blog, but I've also made it from this one, and this is a good one. So if you're looking for a recipe or if you're needing something, check this one out, and it can just help to continue to inspire, because the goal is coming up with, how do I use the ingredients I have and not being so heavily bound by the recipe that I can't get to that point of success of cooking with the ingredients. So oftentimes we can allow recipes to some degree. There's some room and range for adapting. If I don't have said ingredient, as an example, this last week, I made pasta fagioli. I don't have a recipe for that on the website. I used the recipe that Steve Sando has from Rancho Gordo. The recipe calls for celery. I didn't have celery. So instead I doubled up on the carrot, and I also doubled up on the tomato paste. And it was fantastic. And I was using the cranberry beans. So that isn't just, I think, case in point of recipes can be as structured as they need to be for us. And they can also be as just inciting and inspiring creativity that get us cooking in the kitchen to just enjoy the ingredients that we have from the farms and farmers that have taken great care to grow the produce that's feeding our families and households.
I love that you mentioned Rancho Gordo. That's a bean subscription that you get, right, on a regular basis? Or do you just
I
buy them ad hoc?
I buy them ad hoc. I do maybe like a quarterly haul. So it just kind of goes depending on how often I'm going through beans. I'm going through a lot of them right now because we're clearing out our pantry. So it was like, we have all of these beans. I need to start using them. There's the Piquinto beans, the Santa Maria style beans that are like quintessential summertime barbecue. If you have a chance to look up the history of Santa Maria barbecue, like it's very specific with their tri-tip, but those beans are just phenomenal. I have a ham bone left over in the freezer from Easter, and that's going to go into the pot with a little bit of, I have some like final bits of leftover a diced roast ham that's going to go into the pot with the beans. And then that with some crusty bread is going to be delicious. So yes,
Yeah.
Rancho Gordo is one of my favorites.
I know within the CSA Innovation Network, we have not just vegetable farmers, but lots of other types of CSA producers as well. So I was just curious if you have incorporated any other like subscriptions, like a meat or eggs CSA, maybe any local grains that you subscribe to get their flour, whole grains. If you haven't personally, then that could just be something that like I would recommend for CSA farmers
Yeah.
to look into and see if there are other farmers of different items around you that you could suggest to your members also subscribe to support that other portion of the local food economy, and be able to have like a whole swath of ingredients besides the veggies and fruit to make
Yeah.
whole, yummy, delicious meals with.
For sure. Sage Mountain Farm. So for those who are in Southern California, Sage Mountain Farm definitely has a variety of different drop-off points or pickup locations. Heading to their website, taking a look at the map, you'll get to see where those drop-off points are. If you're local to me, Pomona, Upland, Ontario, the greater area, San Gabriel Valley, Claremont Farmers Market is the Sunday pickup point. They also have a meat CSA. They have farm fresh eggs. So there's just, this is where I feel like we've been so spoiled because we have a CSA that really has just about everything. So the supplementation post pickup is one where it's not a whole lot, and the pantry becomes important in terms of what gets stocked, and I can then add on meat, poultry, pork. We'll do that mostly ad hoc. So I'll then kind of portion out and budget. Okay, we're getting to that space where we need to go ahead and make a meat purchase, and then we'll do that. And a lot of that just has come from our own, our family's just paradigm and passion for supporting our local food system. And so however we're able to do that in the best ways that we can, it's not always 100% perfect, but it's really about the progress over perfection here. So as best we can, as much as we can, leaning into supporting our local farms and farmers. That's really where it's at. I know for me, and I know for many who are joining CSAs and really validating the work in this way. There are lots of different, I know CSA Innovation Network has links to resources where for those wherever you are in the country, to be able to identify CSAs or local farms in our area. I also know in California, we also do have the California Farm Directory, and to be able to also find farms in California specific to us, to also find some CSAs and all the different ways that we want to. So lots of good stuff, lots of good stuff.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder of being able to find lots of CSAs around you that are for almost anything you can imagine that comes off of a farm. We have the national CSA map, which is, any farm that's opted in has added themselves to the map as part of our CSA week efforts, which happens every February, which is a great resource. Of course, it's not exhaustive. We know that there are many more CSAs out there that have not added themselves, but it's a good start.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already spent almost an hour together. So I'm going to go ahead and move us into wrapping up. But thank you so much, Frances. And thanks for those of you who joined us. Frances does have her Instagram, email, and website here available. So you can feel free to reach out any way that suits your preferred contact method. Frances has been a great resource and friend to the CSA Innovation Network in providing so many wonderful member resources and inspiration for farmers on what is helpful for your members. We do have a few more resources to share also from Frances. So like we've mentioned a few times, we'll be sending out this presentation and all of the links for reference afterwards. There are some blog posts that are just about CSA success, lessons learned for those newer or beginning members. That is particularly useful. Lots of recipes, weekly, seasonal meal plans. And then I did want to specifically mention, which Scott dropped in the chat earlier, the virtual cooking class that's coming up. So this is our last CSA Ideas Lab session with Francis in the works. It's 1 month from today. It'll be a Sunday afternoon. So Francis will have a nice fresh box of CSA produce that she'll be able to unbox and share fresh ingredients with us, and some recipes and ideas for, making it your own based on where you are in the country and what you have in your CSA that week. So I'm really excited for that. Looking forward to having a freshly cooked dinner with some fresh greens and whatever else comes my way in late July. And we do have another CSA Ideas Lab between now and then. This is an author meet and greet. It is a book chat in a sense, because the stories that will be shared and lessons learned from author Jerry Apps are also things that he has written up into a book on rural communities and farming and agriculture. But it's not at all necessary to have read the book to participate in this conversation with Jerry. He's a farmer turned author and has a lot to say about small farms and supporting local food. So I'm excited for that event as well. We've got a couple other CSA Ideas Labs in the work for the fall. So just stay tuned to the Innovation Network for all of those wonderful virtual events. We love connecting with you all across the country. And thanks so much, Francis, for your time with us today. Really appreciate it. Thanks for joining.